Europe has entered a new geopolitical era. Enlargement, security, and resilience are no longer separate debates, they are the same conversation. Welcome to InvigoratEU Talks, a podcast series born from a major EU-funded Horizon research project, bringing together leading scholars and policymakers from across Europe to do exactly what the name suggests: re-invigorate EU enlargement and neighbourhood policy in a changing world. Over 6 episodes, we move from research to real conversation. We unpack the EU's policy toolbox. We confront the realities of Russian interference and Chinese and Turkish influence in the neighbourhood. We examine how democracy support works on the ground. And we explore the social dimension of enlargement, asking whether formal alignment with EU standards translates into real social cohesion and effective protection of rights. Ultimately, we ask, what does a more resilient Europe actually look like? And how do we get there? Each episode brings together InvigoratEU researchers and the policymakers shaping these debates in real time. This is where evidence meets policy, where ideas are tested and where the thinking happens out loud. I'm Mariam Khotenashvili, Executive Director of TEPSA, the Trans-European Policy Studies Association, and this is InvigoratEU Talks. In this first episode, we turn to the EU's enlargement policy toolbox. What does geopolitical enlargement actually mean in practice? And can the current enlargement methodology still deliver in a context shaped by war, security pressures, and renewed competition among great powers? To explore these questions, we'll look at how the accession framework is working on the ground, where it is under strain, and where it needs to evolve or to be fundamentally rethought. We are joined today by His Excellency, Ambassador of Ukraine to the EU, Vsevolod Chentsov. Also with us is Frank Schimmelfennig, Professor at ETH Zürich and a leading scholar on EU integration and enlargement. I also welcome Funda Tekin, Director of the Institut for European Politics in Berlin and a prominent expert on EU governance and enlargement policy. Funda is also an academic coordinator of the InvigoratEU project. Good morning. Frank, we hear so much about the geopolitical enlargement these days, in the Commission speeches, Council conclusions, think tank papers. But what does geopolitical enlargement actually mean in practice? Is it a genuine shift in how the EU does enlargement, or more of a new label on an old policy?
Well, I think it's more than a new label. It's more than just rebranding enlargement. But I also don't think that it represents a true doctrinal shift in enlargement policy. In my view, it reflects a genuine shift in the motivation and justification for enlargement that was triggered by the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. This invasion has unblocked a highly stalled enlargement process of the previous decade, and it created a new urgency for enlargement. And this is reflected in the geopolitical enlargement. In my view, geopolitical enlargement means that enlargement is perceived as an instrument in the geopolitical rivalry over who controls Europe and how the European international order is shaped. For the candidate countries, it means a genuine geopolitical choice, which camp they want to belong to, and also a path to enhanced security. And for the EU, it's a means to firmly anchor neighboring countries in its own camp and thereby strengthen its own security. That does not mean, however, that the EU has thrown its previous enlargement strategy overboard. The official doctrine still emphasizes a merit-based process based on the fundamental values and norms of the European Union. So, in my view, geopolitics has strengthened the motivation and urgency for enlargement, but it has not fundamentally changed the nature of enlargement. And I think it makes sense because the EU's regional order is based on liberal and supranational values and norms, and it would be counterproductive to admit countries that do not subscribe and adhere to these values. At the same time, I think it creates tensions between geopolitical urgency and the fundamentally long-term nature of domestic transformations in the candidate countries.
Thank you, Frank. Funda, do you think there is a tension between this notion of geopolitical enlargement and the principle of a merit-based process? Because as Frank just described, on the one hand, the EU keeps saying enlargement is merit-based, you reform, you progress step by step. But on the other hand, there is this geopolitical urgency, right? We need these countries closer and we need them in the EU fast. So if the EU prevaricates, Russian military and hybrid interference risks filling this vacuum. How do you square the circle?
Well, yes, thank you, Mariam, for that question. And I see a clear tension between those two logics, if you want to call it that way, the geopolitical enlargement and the merit-based process. And in fact, our project, Invigorating the EU's Enlargement and Neighbourhood Policy for a Resilient Europe, is actually built around those two, the two logics and the tension then. But we also need to realize that every enlargement of the EU so far has also had a geopolitical dimension. I think it's just important to then realize that the connotation of the geopolitical driver differed throughout the years. I mean, to give the example, during the Big Bang enlargement, it was about reuniting Europe and less like today about protecting Europe against an aggressor. So it was more the positive connotation back then. So the security question was a different one back then and today. With regards to the tensions, I think the tension plays out on different dimensions. So first, it is the time dimension that you have just pointed out. So geopolitical enlargement needs to be fast, so it's the urgency. The merit-based approach is slow and it takes long. I think we just need to look into the Western Balkan and their accession process with the European Union. That has been going on for more than 2 decades with some of those countries. And I think another example is with regards to the urgency is the entire example about how to fast track Ukraine into the European Union, and then also the more academic debate around it, what implications fast tracking Ukraine would have on the EU's enlargement policy at large. The second dimension is the credibility dimension. So the credibility of accession perspective in the geopolitical enlargement is strong, while it has been hollowed out in the merit-based approach. I was just running some interviews in Turkey last week, and the accession process has lost all credibility there. That was very clear. At the same time, the geopolitical credible accession promise weakens the EU's accession conditionality regarding reform. So there are certain dilemmas to also look into when we look into the tension between those two approaches. A third dimension with regards to the tension is, for me, the public opinion dimension, because the geopolitical enlargement might have been rather a driver for support for enlargement within the public opinion polls, because after 2022 and 2023, in those years, there was a rise in public opinion support across EU member states for enlargement. And this kind of support has been declining throughout the past 2 years, so to speak. So there was a window of opportunity, a geopolitical one, that might be about to close the longer the procedure lasts. How to square the circle? I think we need to balance out the two principles of enlargement, strengthening the conditionality mechanism and finding solutions to security guarantees, also for Ukraine, most importantly. We need a transparent and strategic communication, both in accession candidate countries and EU member states. And we also might need to go for a more differentiated approach, but we might discuss that later.
Thank you, Funda. Ambassador Chentsov, Ukraine has been making fast progress in EU accession while having to defend itself in a war. Candidate status in 2022, opening of accession negotiations in 2024, rapid screening in 2025, and the interim and closing benchmarks already informally communicated by the European Union. But we also know that formal opening of negotiating clusters has been delayed in the Council by Hungary for more than a year now. From your viewpoint, how does the EU's enlargement methodology feel? What is working? And where does it become difficult or even frustrating in practice?
Thank you very much. If you don't mind, before getting into those technicalities, a few words about geopolitical versus merit-based enlargement. I think it's important to understand, to have the agreement about terminology, right? What we understand by geopolitical enlargement. after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, it was about now we don't have an obstacle, which was Soviet Union, to get Europe reunited. In this case, in Ukraine case, the logic more or less the same. We don't have Russia, which was strategic, big partner selling cheap energy to Europe, which didn't like Ukraine and other neighbors to get closer to Europe. And now this relevance of Russia is gradually disappearing. Okay, it's an aggressive country, still creating a lot of problems, to say the least, in war with Ukraine, but Europe feels more confident to do something against Kremlin's will. So this is how I understand this situation. And if we have an agreement why this enlargement can happen now, then we can probably go into details. So if we understand that, okay, now enlargement is possible, so Ukraine could become an EU member, and what is the interest of EU, if we consider this enlargement as geopolitical, vis-a-vis Russian threat, right? So it's both Ukraine interest, because we are getting stronger, we get all kinds of support, institutional stability, but it's also EU interest to have stable, strong Ukraine neighboring aggressive Russia. So this is my understanding of this geopolitical necessity. It's not because we just want to make it quick. Yes, it is. When we are talking about the speed of enlargement, yes, it is important, also politically important for Ukraine. And yes, you definitely heard about our ambition to finalize negotiations by 2027 and so on and so forth. Yes, this is a political necessity in Ukraine to move fast. Why? To prove that EU is serious about the enlargement, and to prove that membership in the EU bring concrete results fast. And definitely to connect the enlargement exercise with the reconstruction exercise and reform exercise. So this is a kind of Ukraine particularity, right? Ukraine specifics, because country is devastated by the war, and we need really to get it right. Not to end up in the situation that war is over, Europe is not interested any longer in Ukraine, getting back to business as usual with Russia, and we are in trouble. So definitely we need to avoid that type of scenario. So that's why it is urgent, and it needs to be concrete and bringing tangible results. Then about methodology. So if we have this agreement, why we need it fast, then we need to see, when we need to look into methodology, what is the problem with the methodology? My understanding is it was revised in a way not to enlarge. So, sorry to be very cynical. So how we can organize enlargement process to have a good excuse not to enlarge. So this is a current methodology. And why? Or, okay, we can enlarge, but rather as an exception, not as a goal. And we can have 50 stops on the way. Any member state can stop it. And you can have stupid reason to do it, political or real reason. And you mentioned Hungary. And it's a good example, because Hungary used to exploit one argument, which was national minority. And it's not just Ukrainian case. So Hungary raised this issue with any neighboring country, and we don't need to go into detail why. So this is a reality. They really keep it very high on the agenda, no matter which government. Orban government or current government. And we already have this experience with the new government. But as soon as we were ready to look into national minority issue, Orban government came up with dozens of other issues, starting from strategic issues, actually reconsidering or trying to reconsider the agreement to give Ukraine candidate status, saying, by the way, we don't think that Ukraine need to be a member. And in such a situation, you just stop the whole process, because it's not about merit-based approach. It's not about Ukraine ticking this or that box. It's about whether we support or not the enlargement as such. So if we are serious about enlargement, then we definitely need, even using this methodology, but we need to reach an agreement among ourselves, I mean, Ukraine, EU, both member states and institutions, how we proceed using this methodology, because it will take time and efforts to change it. What we do not to misuse the current methodology, if I can put it this way. If we have this agreement, if we identify the real issues we need to tackle, and there are issues, okay, agriculture, it's no-brainer. There will be Poland, there will be France, other big players in the domain, and we need to really to find solutions. So the point is to agree not to invent problems, not to play usual game, then the member states torture and humiliate the neighbors, which was a normal kind of a story of enlargement. And we have many examples, and the enlargement was stalled for years because of these issues between the neighboring countries. So I think this is a crucial issue here, to have this agreement.
Frank, looking at the negotiating frameworks for Ukraine and Moldova, they are very demanding on democratic fundamentals, a key alignment. And as the ambassador said, requiring unanimity by the EU 27 at around 40 or 50 stages of the accession process. Given how much Hungary alone has been able to obstruct via the unanimity rule, was there genuinely no flexibility within the existing treaties to design a more streamlined negotiating framework?
Well, I think the Treaty on European Union, and that's Article 49, I think it's very clear both on substance and procedure. So with regard to substance, it's actually requires, all of these fundamental values and norms to be accepted and promoted by new member states. So there's no way around tying accession to these democratic fundamentals, rule of law, human rights, minority rights, and what else you have in the initial articles of the European Union. On the procedure, it just requires a unanimous decision of the European Council on the application and on the eventual accession treaties. That's the requirement. And those accession treaties then also must be ratified by each of the member states domestically. The rest, especially decisions on the opening and closing of chapters, that's just established practice, but it's nowhere in the treaties. But now, I mean, the issue is that now that it has been established as a practice among the member states, it would again need a unanimous decision to abolish the constant requirement for unanimous council approval of each of these steps. And I think this is nowhere on the horizon. I think member states will not forgo that opportunity to exercise influence on the accession process in this way. We should also not forget that there is no treaty way around the final requirement for a consensus on the accession treaty. So let's assume that Hungary had not been able to prevent all these intermediate steps from moving forward. It would definitely still have had the chance for a final veto on the accession treaty, and then there's also the hurdle of domestic ratification. So at the end of the day, there's no way around finding a unanimous decision and having a unanimous domestic ratification. So until the very end, there's lots of opportunities for member states to block the process.
Just very quick follow-up. Was there actually any attempts by the European Union to reach this unanimous decision to abolish the established practice?
As far as I'm aware of, I don't think so. I haven't seen this. I mean, there have been proposals on this, yeah, but I think it's been very clear to all participants that they were very unlikely to fly.
Funda, the enlargement methodology was, as the ambassador said, last revised in 2020, and that was before Russia's full-fledged war against Ukraine and before the wave of new candidates. So all before this new geopolitical context fully emerged. If you were rewriting it today, what would you change? And more fundamentally, what is the single biggest structural weakness in the current enlargement toolbox?
Well, maybe I would just pick up also where Frank left off, because I think this is also why I brought in the public opinion dimension, because of this unanimity requirement, double unanimity requirement of the actual accession treaty. So I think it's not only important to convince governments that enlargement is a good idea, but it's also, because the ratification then takes place either by parliaments or by referenda. And it's not only then Hungary that we need to have an eye on, but also I think France is really a country that might be in the end very hesitant with regards to accepting additional countries into the European Union. So this is really something what we need to realize. And I also agree with what the ambassador has said, with all those bilateral issues that then actually motivate countries to block the procedure. And it's not only Ukraine that has made that experience, but another example is also North Macedonia, which actually changed its flag, its name, its constitution with regards to minority issues. And then again, I think Turkey is also an example with the conflictual situation regarding Cyprus. So there are those really manifold examples for bilateral relations between member states and accession candidates that obstruct the procedure. With regards to the biggest structural weakness in the current toolbox, I really think it is the unanimity requirement during the accession negotiations, because I think that is, and if we then go back to the entire credibility issue within the EU's enlargement policy, this is really undermining it. And this is also what Frank has said. This is something that in theory could easily be changed because it is just an established praxis. So I think that is something what I would rewrite. I would also look more into flexibilization of the procedure. And I think here with Ukraine and Moldova, the front loading of chapters was something very smart, actually, to do. So I think this is something to look more into. And then also more civil society engagement. I think this is also important because it cannot be just the technical procedure of ticking boxes. And it is also important to realize that if you have, reformed all your procedures and structures, it's about the persons who are going to implement it. And this is as important as the technical reforms on paper. So civil society engagement, this might also then include visa liberalization. I think this is also something to look into, because that then facilitates people-to-people contact. And then in the end, I also think that more looking into the idea of gradual integration. It's already part of the current methodology, but really looking and fine-tuning it more, because this is then where the countries then feel the merit. They reform and then they actually feel the merit in a more differentiated and flexible approach.
Thank you for already mentioning gradual integration. We'll speak about that as well. And thank you also for highlighting, Funda, the public opinion. I think the question in the EU on accession, I think the question really is, what does it do to the credibility to the entire enlargement process? If then, after all these costly and painful reforms, public opinion in one country could actually reverse the whole process. But Ambassador Chentsov, from Ukraine's perspective, especially in the context of war, are there areas of EU-required legislative alignment that feel particularly difficult to implement right now, or even somewhat disconnected from the current reality? And beyond that, what would you most want to change in how the EU manages the accession process day to day?
Well, definitely the reform process needs prioritization in Ukraine, and we need to take into account the current challenges, I mean security challenges, but also financial, social challenges, because more than 10%, maybe up to 20% of people now temporarily relocated outside Ukraine or internally displaced. So all those challenges, they need a very, very, very careful approach by the government and parliament while we are planning our reform agenda. To give it an example, for instance, reform in the law enforcement field, reform of the security service of Ukraine. Yes, there is an agreement that the service need to be converted into the kind of a European style counterintelligence agency. At the same time, they need now to perform a lot of investigations and to do operational activity inside Ukraine, and they involve not only inside Ukraine, but also they perform together with armed forces operations outside. So this is an example, and you cannot change this system because it will be just dangerous now during the war. Or railway, we understand that we will need to bring the system into conformity of the EU requirements, but today railways play a strategic role also for military mobility, and you rather avoid any serious risks to compromise the efficiency of functioning of the railway when you start changing the ownership structure, or you decouple ownership of the infrastructure and the moving stock. So things like that, you can look into those issues during peace, but now we need to start working on the legislation to understand when it will be possible to go through the parliament. So this is Ukrainian peculiarity now, and definitely when we are prioritizing the reforms, we need to look into other, let's say, domains. For instance, we have already a third, if I remember correctly, financial instrument offered by Ukraine. Now it's called Ukraine Support Law, and it consists of actually big defense elements. So the 60 billion will be spent to reinforce Ukrainian defense, and around 30 for civilian needs. And when we are talking about this second part of the financial instrument, it's dropped into macrofinancial assistance instrument and Ukraine facility part. Both of them will contain conditionalities. And we will need to look into taxation, tax reform, customs reform, and many other issues related to the fiscal discipline or collection of revenues in Ukraine. And it is obvious that both European Union, International Monetary Fund, they will take care that while using this big financial support from outside, we need to make sure that we collect as much as possible inside Ukraine. So those are the examples how we need to coordinate between different instruments and also taking into account security and other risks.
Thank you very much for highlighting these practical issues, Mr. Ambassador. Very quickly, do you find understanding in EU capitals and institutions on these matters, on deprioritizing these matters, are not currently Ukraine's priority?
Yes, we do. It's not always easy. So we need to explain, we need to prove, we need to guarantee, to take commitments. Well, what is the usual way that you provide kind of a reliable arguments, but also realistic time frame? You say, okay, it is not impossible to do now, and the question is when. Okay, and say, okay, we table the legislation next year, and we make sure that we pass it in 2028. So this is a serious conversation. So we cannot say no. We're not going to do it. It will not pass.
Frank, you have written a lot about the differentiated integration model or flexible integration as a possible way forward. Can you explain what that model would actually look like in practice, and how might it work for countries like Ukraine, Moldova, or those in the Western Balkans? And also, why do you see it as a potentially more realistic than the traditional model of full accession?
Well, Mariam, first of all, I think we need to qualify the so-called classical model of full accession, because also in the past, new members have not benefited from full participation in all EU policies or the full rights of membership from day one of their accession to the European Union. Yeah? Just to give you some example, I mean, the free movement of labor has typically been restricted for new members for several years. Also, they did not automatically join the Eurozone or the Schengen area, but needed to qualify for these additional steps first. So there have always been transition periods and additional requirements after accession. In that way, accession has always been flexible or differentiated. And so it would not break at all with established enlargement practice if the new member states now would also be excluded from several EU policies and benefits, provided that this exclusion was temporary in principle. I think there is a new element, however, and there is a new situation. And this new situation is that many of the old member states are concerned about the scenario of another Hungary. That is a country that, after joining, backslides on the fundamental values and norms of the EU and uses its veto powers to block decisions, for instance, and mainly in foreign and security policy. And I think that is a valid concern, not just a tool to postpone enlargement, but it reflects, let's say, a genuine dilemma of enlargement. So in this situation, the EU basically has two options. One would be to postpone enlargement until it can be pretty sure that democratic backsliding will not happen. The problem is, of course, that you can never be sure, and that this could even happen in the old member states, of course. So it would also run against the geopolitical urgency of enlargement, and it would frustrate candidate governments, candidate populations, to be put in the waiting room for a very long time. So the other option is that the EU could admit candidate countries with institutional restrictions and safeguards. And that, I think, is the core of the current proposal. And this would actually be a new kind of differentiated accession because it would be institutional, which hasn't happened before. So one of the main proposals is to admit new members with full normal voting rights, but without veto rights, above all in foreign and security policy. Another proposal has to do with reversibility. So if countries backslide, they would lose access to policies, funding, and voting rights. And they would also lose that in a procedure that is, let's say, more feasible than the current Article 7 procedures. There are many models around. Just this morning, we've heard about an initiative by the German Chancellor Merz to give Ukraine something like an associate membership, which would mean institutional representation without voting rights and some kind of security guarantee in addition. So in my view, such a differentiated approach to accession would alleviate some of the major concerns that old member states have, and it would offer the candidates a chance to become EU members earlier than they would otherwise, and would be, as an advantage as compared to being kept in the waiting room for much longer.
Thank you, Frank. Funda, to follow up on that, do you share Frank's assessment? Do you think that differentiated integration would actually advance the membership of new candidate countries? Or could it actually become a convenient excuse for the EU to keep candidates in this permanent waiting room?
Well, I share his assessment in terms of, that the way forward with regards to accession and or enlargement, depending on the perspective you take, is actually, based on different models of differentiated integration. And I also find it very interesting because there's also the one model that is speaking of the staged accession. This is what Frank has already outlined, in terms of more institutional differentiation. And there are also some member states were rather skeptical, not because using it as a waiting room thought, but more being afraid of that candidate countries could then become very, very satisfied with a lesser form of integration. So just economic integration, for example. So it's both ways. It could be actually kind of obstruct a full membership. It's then the question of whether also the European Union itself might become more differentiated in the future. So it's really, the entire idea of how united in diversity is going to play out in the future. So this might then also not really be a waiting room, but just, certain areas of integration. With all these different models, for me, it's very important to realize that, the rule of law requirement is the one thing that cannot be differentiated. And I think also what Frank was already alluding to the different, transitory periods. And for me also, very new thing in the new draft of the accession treaties is also that there is the thinking of actually including a clause of also integrating stricter rule of law conditionality mechanisms for new members. I see the idea behind it because we don't want to have a second Hungary. But this is then also the question of, the equal rights among member states, So this is really something where I think also lawyers might have, or legal scholars might need to have a closer look at it in order to find the right solution. Maybe just as a final thought, the entire idea, and I think that was something that was tabled by the Commission, is the so-called reversed enlargement. And that would actually kind of reverse the logic of the staged accession. So that would then first allow the accession candidate country to exceed the European Union with limited institutional rights. And afterwards, it's then the question of how to deal with the reform requirement. And I think this is something that was rejected by the member states, but also in the academic circles, that was perceived very critically, because we still need to have some sort of conditionality on the reform momentum in the country.
Thank you, Funda. I think it's a good point that you raise, and possibly calls another episode of podcast the pre-accession conditionality versus possible post-accession conditionality to avoid cases of democratic backsliding that we've seen in Hungary, but not only. Ambassador Chentsov, from Ukraine's perspective, but also thinking more broadly about Moldova and the Western Balkans, do you see this type of differentiated integration as the best way forward? Or is there a danger that it could actually weaken the credibility of the enlargement process itself?
I think the differentiation is needed when, again, what we mean by this differentiation, because if we apply a merit-based approach, it will depend on the each and every exceeding country how fast it moves, right, on the accession track. At the same time, when we are talking about possibilities for deeper trade and economic integration during this period, yeah, it makes sense. So you mentioned this German paper, and there were other ideas. The only thing we need to avoid working on such ideas is freezing of the situation. That, okay, we get the status, there is even world membership in the title, so you should be happy. Yes, we need to avoid this. And as I see in the letter which the German Chancellor sent to President Costa and Ursula von der Leyen, this is it made very clear that it's not an alternative, that accession process should not only go on, but should be accelerated. But in the meanwhile, Ukraine, because in the letter Ukraine was presented as a special case, which definitely right thing to do, need to get something meaningful between now and then Ukraine is a member. So definitely we can play with the words to avoid this confusion that Ukraine is given something else, not the membership. And I think it's doable. What is also necessary to get not only nice symbolic, not only symbolic, but also practical things like being able to sit at the council, or to send parliamentarians to see how European Parliament is working. So this is important, but to get this experience. But what is more important, to get economic benefits. For instance, internal market treatment for Ukraine now. Why? Because we are facing very serious challenges in CBAM, especially it's in this carbon border adjustment measure, especially its planned second edition for our metallurgical sector, for our energy sector. We see serious challenge in new steel measures, which European Union is actually enacting. So the point is very simple. Ukraine and eventually other exceeding countries need to be placed inside this circle, because if we are treated as a third country economically alongside Brazil and others, with all respect, it will not work. So the position of commissioner without portfolio for Ukraine will not help Ukrainian economy during reconstruction, especially. So it's interesting idea. We need to work on that.
Well, before we close, I'd like to ask each of you the same final question, and I'd like to ask you to respond to me in one sentence. We've talked about geopolitics, we've talked about conditionality, institutional constraints, war and reform. But if you could change just one thing tomorrow, one rule, one political commitment, one decision-making mechanism to make the EU enlargement policy genuinely more effective and credible, what would it be? If I may start with Frank.
Yeah, I think we've talked about it. I think the most important thing that I would change, if it was possible, was to get rid of unanimity in the process of enlargement.
Funda.
That is what I would have also said. So let me say something different, and maybe to include a new thought in the debate. I would also revitalize the debate on institutional reforms of the European Union itself, to really then make sure that the capacity to act is preserved.
Ambassador Chentsov, you have the final word.
To move fast, indeed, maybe if miracle happens and the member states do not use their veto rights to open and close cluster, keeping the possibility to take a final decision, that would be really helpful, not to lose time. But which is more important, to make sure that the process is credible on both sides. If we take a commitment, we stick to the commitment.
Well, it comes through very clearly from this discussion that the EU enlargement is no longer a peripheral topic. The EU enlargement process defines the future of the European Union, its security and well-being. My heartfelt thanks to Ambassador Vsevolod Chentsov, to Professor Frank Schimmelfennig and Professor Funda Tekin for joining us. I'm Mariam Khotenashvili, and this has been InvigoratEU Talks. Thank you for listening. This episode is brought to you by TEPSA, and it's part of the InvigoratEU project funded by the European Union.